For weeks now, most of the global public has been focused on Washington, D.C. when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, ironically. Instead of what's been going on the ground, they've been focused on the U.S. Congress in particular, and especially the House of Representatives, because back in February, a bill was passed to allocate $95 billion to a number of countries, $60 billion of which was to Ukraine. And so many people have been focused on, man, we need to get that money out. And a lot of drama happened over the weekend. They finally voted on it, passed the bill. Now then they're starting to figure out, unwind all that. What's it going to mean? How many weapons are going to go? When is it going to start arriving? And all that kind of stuff. Well, beneath the surface, the war has continued on without regard to what it does or doesn't happen in Washington, D.C. And we want to focus a little bit on what has been happening on the ground, what is currently happening on the ground, and then we want to touch on a little bit of what this money may mean going forward, and will it change the outcome? Will it have the impact that so many people that are for Ukraine hope that it does? And we have literally no one better to try and unwind some of this stuff than Professor John Mearsheimer, favorite of our show, professor at the University of Chicago, international relations theorist extraordinaire. We lift that word off the title there. It's extraordinaire. One of the best that there is. John, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Danny.
Well, listen, because of a lot of the things that have been happening on here, we really do value your ability to kind of pierce the surface level of what's going on or what we may see, and tell us what things actually mean under the surface. And we got a lot to do today. Over the past over the past year or so, I mean, it's been methodically moving forward and picking up pace. That this war is not just killing lots of Ukrainian people. And we've shown that map several times from the ISW, where you show how much the line has changed. They're moving to the west, and it's kind of anesthetic, really. It's just a graphic representation. But we want to talk a little bit about the physical representation today, about what's been going on. And in cities such as, let's see, I think the first one is Marinka. Yeah, Marinka. Gary, throw those videos up there. This is one of the towns has been under siege for quite a long time. This one here is the pictures here is from January 23, so quite a while back. But it's been a scene of fighting, and it was only completely cleared by the Russians just a few months back. But when you're looking at some of these images, like you're seeing here, remind me of some of the images I saw after Hiroshima in World War II, where everything was just flattened and hardly any walls are even standing in many parts of it here. And then, of course, into Bakhmut, when that battle took place, that was a 9-month battle, which was Russia methodically worked through. And again, hardly any buildings left over. You can just see it. It's just hard to imagine. This is these images here are from June, but the battle, in some regards continues on. Russia still uses some of it today to hide troops, ironically, in some of those theaters. And then most recently there was Avdiivka, which was, again, many months in the making. But you see the destruction, which Gary will throw up here in just a second. I mean, almost all these, I could just take the names off of them and just put them up there, and you wouldn't even know there's any difference, because the bottom line is it is just wreaking absolute devastation and destruction on the ground. And that is the real consequence of this, is that all the time this war is going on, Ukraine territory is just getting obliterated on top of the human casualties. And I just wonder, when you think about these things and when you think about the course of the war and you see these kinds of images, what does that make you feel like, and what do you think when you, in terms of where the war should go?
Well, when I see these images, what it tells me is that this is a good old-fashioned war of attrition, where you have two armies that are basically standing toe-to-toe and pounding each other. And a lot of the talk these days is about how much territory the Russians have captured or have not captured. And I think that territory matters. There's no question about that. But it's not the principal indicator of what's going on between the two sides. And I think the Russians are not that interested in conquering territory. There's talk about them using human wave tactics and pushing forward and trying to break through and failing and so forth and so on. But actually, that's not what the Russians are doing. The Russians are mainly relying on their artillery and their air power to inflict massive casualties on the Ukrainian army. and excuse me, and try to collapse that army if they can. They're not that concerned with capturing territory. But regarding the pictures that you just showed, the fact is that the Ukrainians have a good number of well defended positions in cities in the eastern part of Ukraine. And before the Russians can move forward and before the Russians can win this war of attrition, they have to beat the Ukrainians in those cities. And that's what they have been doing. And they have been using huge amounts of firepower. Again, not human wave tactics. But when you use huge amounts of firepower in cities, as you know better than I do, Danny, the end result is that you destroy most of the buildings, most of the infrastructure in those cities. And that's what's going on here.
Yeah, and really to your point, you just said there about artillery slash rockets and air power. There has been some advancements in recent days. There was a lot of talk earlier in the war that where's the Russian Air Force? They're not out here. They aren't as good as what everybody thought, or that the Ukraine air defense was better than they thought. Well, that started to go away. Maybe as much as a year ago, but it's been picking up speed a lot. And that is one of the big reasons, the lack of tactical air defense for the Ukraine side, and the Russians are taking advantage of it. This is from Alex from History Legends on a video he just released yesterday, showing here is the current issue and how Russia is succeeding in the air.
What made Ukrainian counterattacks difficult, just like in Chasiv Yar, was Russian aviation. On April 15th alone, 6 Russian attack helicopters fired a total of 240 unguided rockets at the enemy. This clearly shows the impact of Ukraine's lack of air defense capabilities. And if they don't find a solution pretty quick, it's just going to get worse from there.
And that's on rotary wing helicopters moving in here, which tells you a lot, because as someone who used to was in an armored unit and actually had attack helicopters in our formations, those things are very vulnerable, and we always had them far over our shoulder, and only if we were able to clear the tactical air defense from the enemy above. And the fact that they're now in fairly large numbers that close to the front tells me that Russia has successfully gotten rid of most of that. I'm sorry. Yeah, you wanted to say something?
I just want to jump in here very quickly, Danny. In the video and in your comments right before the video, a lot of emphasis was put on the deteriorating air defenses that the Ukrainians have. In other words, they can't shoot down helicopters or aircraft like they could earlier in the war. I think that's correct. But there's one other element in this story, and it may be even a more important element. And that is that the Russians have taken these dumb bombs, these mini dumb bombs that they have. They've put kits on them that turn guidance kits, that turn them from dumb bombs to smart bombs, which allows the aircraft that launch those bombs to stand off at a distance and basically put the bombs in a pickle barrel. And this has had a devastating effect, not only on the frontline Ukrainian troops, but on infrastructure and troop concentrations right behind the front lines and even deeper into Ukraine.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, John, we actually have some video on that. I'm gonna get to that in just a second. But to underscore how impactful it is on the ground, I'm going to have another video here by a guy named Weeb Union. I'll just warn you before, he's got a pretty strong accent, so it's kind of hard to follow along with some of the stuff he's saying. But what you're going to see is, again, very recent imagery and graphic representation of what the Russian is doing on the ground. And what you'll see is depicted here. This is just west of Avdiivka. So after you saw that imagery a while ago where the Russians took Avdiivka, they didn't stop there. They've continued to go forward. Now that you'll see, as of today, there is a significant penetration deep into the Ukrainian lines, and he's going to show you on the map, even if you don't understand all the stuff he says, what's going to happen next. Check this out.
The Battle of Oshiretsine here in the northern flank of Avdiivka is extremely important for the following weeks in the west of Avdiivka. We see that the Ukrainians had their 3 lines of defense west of Avdiivka. They had Stepove, Berdishi, Semenivka, Orlivka, Tonenke. The Russians captured Lastochkine, Sheverne, Tonenke, and Orlivka, which moved the Ukrainians on to the second line, which was Berdishi, Semenivka, Umanske, Yestrodivka, and Netailove. The Russians are close to capturing Semenivka and Berdishi and have bypassed them to go on to the third line of defense of the Ukrainians, which goes to Ozheretine, Novokhmativka, and so on, all the way here to the western parts. It is likely that the Russians, with the control over Ozheretine and Novokhmativka, would pass over this third line of defense, capturing the northern parts of it, before moving on to the western parts to gain full control over this arch here in between the northern parts of Avdiivka to the lakes here in the western parts and Nitelova in the south. At the same time, the Russians will fight over Nitelova here to the south before moving on to Yasnobrodivka and Umansk. Taking control of this entire zone to west of Avdiivka will allow the Russians to use Avdiivka and Donetsk to develop further offensive operation here in the area.
Interesting thing also, John, I spoke with Alex of History Relations. We've had him on our show several times. And he said one other thing that's making those rapid movements forward, because this is not I guess a stalemate, as some call it. You see there's significant, you see these towns and villages are falling one right after the other. And now Russia's made a deep penetration from which they can then branch off and flank some of these other units, which will almost certainly cause the Ukraine side to fall back further. One of the things that Alex told me, which is a change of late, is that he's seen lots of videos where Russian formations now in larger numbers, 4, 5, 6, and 7 armored vehicle convoys are moving across without hitting mines. He said that the Ukraine side is running short on anti-tank mines, which now makes the rapid movement even faster for the Russian side.
Yeah. And just more generally, it's quite clear that the best Ukrainian defensive positions, to include lines and cities, was further to the east. And the Russians are in the process of tearing apart those defensive positions and defensive lines, in the easternmost part of Ukraine and moving westward where there are not formidable defenses. And this includes mines, as you were talking about, but it includes trenches and all sorts of obstacles that are designed to slow down the Russians. So my sense is that, after a few weeks here, as the Russians move further westward and continue to attrit the Ukrainian army, their task moving forward will become easier.
Yeah, and John, I want to go back to what you had mentioned a second ago about these glide bombs, because I think that is an underrepresented really advancement, because Russia is now mass producing them. They've been using them for a while in smaller numbers, but now then they're starting to get them in larger numbers. And here's what these glide bombs are. This is an FAB 500, one of the more common ones that's used. The FAB 2500 is another one. Look, these have been the bombs themselves have been in existence and in their inventory since the 60s. I mean, they go that far back. They were just basically gravity bombs. You just dropped them and you hope that they would land on target. But now then, with these kits that they put on them, as you said, they can drop them into a pickle barrel. This glide kit, as you see depicted on the top here, is literally, it's a glide, like a glide airplane. But it has a guidance system on the nose, which will bring it onto a pinpoint target at up to 45 miles away, which means that the Russian aircraft, like the ones you saw in the opening scene there, are able to launch these things from well outside of the range of any of the tactical air defense capacities that they have. And now then you see that they're going to more than just the 250 and 500. Now they're also going to the larger 1,500 and 3,000. And here's the thing about this, Gary, if you can show that second set of it. Yeah. So here they are in one of the factories where they're going to show some of these larger bombs. And you see how these things are massive. I think the ones on the left are the 1500s, if I'm not mistaken. I think they'll show that in a second. But these things are just gargantuan. You're going to see some of the results of what these things look like when they hit the ground here. And you'll see why the destruction that we showed you in the opening scenes are happening. Just look at that. That's from one bomb that goes in and can just devastate an area. Now Russia is launching, many scores of these things every single day, sometimes even in the hundreds in some areas. There's no defense against these. The Ukraine side can't shoot them down because they're just gravity bombs that literally glide onto target. And when Russia could continue to mass produce these things and bring them in almost, unabated, and the Ukraine side can't shoot down a glide bomb, or they can't hit the aircraft that's launching it because they can't reach it out that far. The Ukraine side, aside from the artillery shells, and we're going to talk about the significance of that in a second, that's not their biggest problem. Their biggest problem is the inability to shoot down these glide bombs.
Yeah, when I was in the Air Force way back when, and then when I was a graduate student, I studied bombing quite carefully, including the launching of nuclear weapons, as well as conventional weapons against particular targets. And what you end up caring about is accuracy, number one, number two, the size of the bomb, and number three, the hardness of the target. And what we have here is a situation where the accuracy, which really matters, is terrific because they have been, these dumb bombs have been turned into glide bombs. And then, as you showed in the video, those bombs that they're dropping pack a lot of punch. These are huge bombs that are very accurate. And then when you talk about the hardness of the target, these are basically unprotected targets. So when you put the bomb in the pickle barrel, you're going to destroy the target, whether it's infrastructure or it's troop concentrations. And when you have lots of bombs and you're dropping them every day, the consequences over the long term are going to be devastating for the Ukrainian forces.
Yeah, and I think that the bigger, well, one of the additional big problems is that this is not a balanced issue. It's not like the Ukraine side has a bunch on their side to drop in. They can shoot because Russia's air defense systems, which they do have tactical in the forward area, actually can reach out to the Ukrainian ships when they fly up there, which is very rare because they don't have many airframes left anyway. So this is a very one-sided issue there. And I as a military person, I just don't see an answer to this and what the Ukraine side can do. So we just had this big, package passed in Congress, that's going to allegedly free up lots of artillery shells, which will be desperately, grateful by the Ukraine side. But firing, a 155 millimeter artillery shell that I can hold in my hand with ease and a FAB, 1,500 kilogram bomb, those things aren't equal. And I don't know that it's going to matter that much.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that we're not going to give the Ukrainians anything that is an antidote to these glide bombs. The glide bombs are going to continue to be dropped on top of the Ukrainians. There's nothing that can change that. We're going to apparently give them artillery, and we're going to give them some air defense systems, which can shoot down aircraft or shoot down drones or shoot down cruise missiles. But the problem there is, as you pointed out before, that these planes that the Russians have that are launching the smart bombs can stand off at a great distance, which means they're outside the range of any air defense systems that we give to the Ukrainians. Moreover, you can rest assured that once we give these air defense systems to the Ukrainians, the Russians will put their gun sights on those new air defense systems and go to great lengths to destroy them, just as they've destroyed all the air defense systems that we previously gave them.
Right. Yeah, that's the frustrating part to me is I still see so many people talking about, well, that's coming and it'll have some effect. But I mean, the numbers that I've seen so far of systems themselves and interceptor missiles is quite modest anyway. And that's on top of all the attrition they've already had in the lost systems that they started off with, the ones that we've already given. Even the Patriot systems have been taken out. So all of these things are just like a Band-Aid, I think. And here's the thing, John, is that people are starting to recognize this belatedly, but people are coming around to it. And Viktor Orban had a comment, I believe it was just yesterday, where he's starting to voice more than he has been, a little frustration with where things are going. Check this out.
We respect the rights of Ukraine, sovereignty of Ukraine, and people to create their own and maintain their own state. So therefore, invasion of Putin against Ukraine is totally against the values of international relations and all the values we all respect. So no question of that. But the Hungarian point of interest is that something must be between Russia and Hungary. So this is the number one. So we support Ukraine to survive somehow, which is questioned because Ukraine is not more sovereign state. Ukraine is now just protectorate of the West. So without getting the money and the weapons from the European Union and United States, Ukraine as a state would cease to exist. So it's not a sovereign state anymore.
He's just saying what's true, not what anybody wants. And you know, most of the other Western statesmen are all saying what they want to be true, not what is true. But you see, I think some frustration on the Hungarian side, even more than it has been, is that, look, we want a rough state. We want something in between us and Russia. We don't want NATO to be right on the Russian border anyway. And he's just saying, look, the way things are going, all these things we keep showing with the methodical movement west, the destruction of the Ukrainian army, now then the proliferation of these FAB bombs. I mean, the writing's on the wall, and he sees it, and he's ready to have some kind of a negotiated settlement, it looks to me like.
Yeah, I think that Orban's instincts on the need to settle this one as soon as possible are correct. And you and I both agree on that point. But I think Orban is wrong in his hunch or his assessment that the Russians are going to go all the way to the Polish or Hungarian or Romanian border and conquer all of Ukraine. I don't think they're going to do that. I'm not sure they have the capability. And furthermore, I think they would be crazy to try to conquer the western part of Ukraine because it's filled with ethnic Romanians who ethnic Ukrainians, who would resist mightily. So I don't think that's going to happen. So I don't think Orban has to worry about that. The big problem Orban faces moving forward, and the Hungarians face moving forward, and we all face moving forward, is that relations, when the shooting stops, between Russia on one side and Ukraine and the West on the other are going to be terrible. And there's going to be a very hostile environment between both sides for as far as the eye can see. And there's going to be an ever-present danger of escalation. This is another reason that we should try to settle this now and do it on terms that go some way to ameliorate relations between Russia on one side and the West on the other. But we're actually heading in the other direction.
Yeah, we are. And for sure, that's what we should be doing because every bit of graphic physical evidence screams that. But I'll tell you who doesn't think that, and that's Volodymyr Zelensky, who, after this package was announced by Congress, gets eager about talking about what his next 4 priorities are going to be.
The 4 priorities are key: protection of the sky, modern artillery, long-range capability, and ensuring that the American support packages arrive as quickly as possible.
So he's like, okay, now then we can get back to all these 4 things so that we can start methodically doing things. But number one, he doesn't look at the fact that what's actually been passed is really amazing to me. $60 billion, as J.D. Vance wrote in the New York Times last week, in comparison with the $200 billion that has already been provided up to through 2023 offensive operations, which did nothing but break their teeth on the Russian defenses. We won't regurgitate that. But now that $60 billion is, just a fraction of that. But it's not $60 billion, John. When you look at what it is, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin bragged that $50 billion of that or near it is going to American use and American facilities and American manufacturers. Only a small portion of that's actually even going to Ukraine. So even what's regularly going to go to Ukraine, it's going to be a drop in the bucket.
Let me ask you a question. And let me preface it by saying I've been trying to figure out what is going to go to Ukraine, right? There's this talk that the bill passed and so much money is going to be allocated for Ukraine, $61 billion. Okay. But what weaponry is going to go to Ukraine over the next couple months to shift the balance? I've been unable to really find any evidence of what they're going to get.
Yeah, you see on this screen here, the second category there, 11.3 billion. I'm sorry, no, the third one, 13.8 billion for the procurement of advanced weapon systems and defense articles. And what I've heard is specifically, I think 2 of the priorities that Zelensky talked about there, which were artillery shells and interceptor missiles for air defense, but no talk so far of how many. And that is absolutely vital, because we've already seen that we've given somewhere around 3 million artillery shells to date. And again, you see all that's doing is maybe slowing down Russia's offensive move to the west. So how many more are we talking about now? And if it's less than 3 million, one has to ask, how's that going to help? And I assure you, it won't be anywhere near 3 million.
When I see the word procurement in that slide that you put up, I say to myself, does procurement mean this is the third bullet point? You know, 13.8 billion for the procurement of ... Uh, what does procurement mean? That they're going to have to go out and buy these weapons, build these weapons, or are these weapons already on the shelf? I have no sense that there's this panoply of weapons that are on the shelf. And now that the money's been passed, all they have to do is take the weapons off the shelf and give the weapons to the Ukrainians. And the fact that nobody in the administration is talking about what weapons they're going to get real soon makes me think that there are hardly any weapons on the shelf.
Well, here's what I
That's
did here
true.
just hours ago. There's going to be some number of Bradley fighting vehicles, M113 vehicles, which were in use when you were serving in the Army, and some more Humvees. So that's the first thing, and that's what's coming to the rescue quickly. Apparently, they've got those packages ready to go. But I mean, those are just minor helps on the set. That does nothing to stop what Russia's doing that we've shown.
Yeah, they want artillery pieces. They want artillery tubes. They want artillery shells, lots of shells, and they want air defense systems. Giving them, an armored personnel carrier or lots of armored personnel carriers and Bradleys is not the same thing. It's not a substitute. The truth is they don't really need many Bradleys. They just get shot to doll rags anyway. They need artillery.
I know.
And I just don't have any sense that we have an inventory ready to go that's going to solve the problem. And I would note to you, Danny, if you look at most of the stories that have been written over the past, let's say, week about the situation in Ukraine and this bill that just passed, almost everybody says that the Ukrainians are hanging on by a thread. And thank God this bill passed. Okay, that's the argument. Well, if you admit that they're hanging on by a thread, that means you better get a lot of equipment over there pronto. Otherwise, they're going to lose quickly. But again, I don't see any evidence that we can reverse the situation that the Ukrainians are in and make it possible for them to stand up in a meaningful way to the Russians over the course of 2024.
And John, I remember so vividly during that debate that you and I participated in at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, where you said then, before it had happened, you said, listen, this $61 billion is not going to change the outcome. Ukraine is going to lose whether they get the money, whether they don't. Now then that it has passed, you can graphically show why it isn't. But that doesn't stop others in the West from ignoring the realities that you have so articulately laid out. And Rishi Sunak, a couple of hours ago, came and bragged about what his country is going to do. First, note what he says, and then I'll comment on the backside of that.
Today, we go further. We will send Ukraine an additional £500 million, hitting £3 billion of support this year, and will provide them with the largest ever package of UK military equipment. This will include more than 400 vehicles, 4 million rounds of ammunition, 60 boats and offshore raiding craft, vital air defences, and long-range, precision-guided Storm Shadow missiles. And as we make our historic commitment to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, we'll move past this stop-start, piecemeal way of backing Ukraine, so that alongside our long-term security guarantee, we are today providing a long-term funding guarantee of at least the current level of military support to Ukraine for every year it is needed.
So he's basically saying he's ready for a forever war, and we'll just keep giving you this money every year. But it's number one, I thought it was comical that he makes a point of saying 60 boats. I don't remember that being on Zelensky's list, and now that's going to reverse the fight on the ground. But then it's half a billion pounds. That's so. We just gave 60 or allocated 60. He gave 0.5 of one. And so why does anybody think any of this is going to make any difference?
I don't know. And you want to remember that in a lot of the discussion about the virtues of this bill, the argument is made that what this will do is enable the Ukrainians to hold against the Russians this year in 2024. And then in 2025, the Ukrainians will be able to go back on the offensive. And this time it'll work, and they will end up recapturing that territory that they failed to capture last year in 2023. This is delusional. It's not clear you'll ever get another package like this through the US Congress. It happened this time. I'm not sure it's going to happen again. But even if you do get a package through, you're never going to be able to constitute a Ukrainian force that is as formidable as the one that we helped build up for the June 2023 counteroffensive. So the idea that the Ukrainians in the future can recapture territory from the Russians is delusional. The best you can do is maintain the status quo. I don't think you'll be able to do that, but the best you can possibly do is maintain the status quo on the battlefield. And if you accept that logic, then you ought to cut a deal now. There's no point in fighting year after year just to maintain the status quo. But of course, selling that argument to the decision makers in Washington and London and assorted other capitals is well nigh impossible.
Yeah, it is. And part of the reason for that impossibility is because everyone, or so many people, Sunak is one of the worst, Stoltenberg of NATO is another one of the really bad ones, is that they almost give fealty to Volodymyr Zelensky. We've shown here where in the past where John Kirby has said Zelensky and only Zelensky will make a decision whether they go to negotiation or whatever. Well, here's what Zelensky's saying, I think it was yesterday, about how he views his role here in this war. Check this out.
How long should Americans be expected to fund the war in Ukraine?
The Americans are not funding the war in Ukraine. They first and foremost protect freedom and democracy all over Europe. And Ukraine is fighting, and Ukraine is sending its best sons and daughters to the front line, and it reduces the price for all Europe, for all NATO. It reduces the price for everyone, including the US.
So oddly enough, he starts out by saying the U.S. isn't funding the war, which he just got this money. So I'm not even sure what that even means. But then, John, I think the bigger thing that's concerning to me is he kind of has a Messiah complex. He kind of says, I'm fighting for all of you. I'm going to keep all of Europe and America safe. So keep giving me this money. And as you just said, it's delusional. There is no possibility of him doing that.
But what he is saying is effectively what American figures in the establishment have been saying for purposes of getting this bill passed. They were arguing that this is really a fight about freedom and democracy. The other side of the bad guys, we're the good guys. Our, regime type is on the line. And furthermore, if the Russians are successful in Ukraine, then they will attack into Eastern Europe and eventually into Western Europe. And therefore, what the Ukrainians are really doing is fighting our battle for us. They're defending the front lines. And this is effectively what Zelensky was saying. And it is very similar to what, Secretary of Defense Austin, Secretary of State Blinken, and President Biden have been saying. So I don't find it unusual. But of course, it is delusional. And if we had any sense, which we don't have, we'd work to cut a deal now and save Ukrainian lives and save the Ukrainians territory that the Russians will otherwise capture if we continue this war.
Well, now let me ask you this question. How can this play out in terms of this delusion that we have? I mean, you see, Rishi Sunak is still saying this. Stoltenberg is still saying these same kinds of things they've been saying since the outset of the war. Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense is saying the same things. All of them keep that same myth going. But it can't go on too much longer. You see the pace that the Russians are moving is starting to pick up. And if they actually do, as apparently the British intelligence has been saying, come in with a big push somewhere in a larger offensive at some weak point in the front here, they could literally break through in some of these areas. Because as you saw there earlier, they're becoming more brittle, but also they don't even have the minds to create these formidable lines of defense. And so if Russia does break through and they have strategic reserves to actually exploitation forces to break through some of these gaps, this could fall apart quickly. What will our leaders say then?
2 quick points. The first point is that the real chink in the armor from their point of view is actually not weaponry, it's manpower. They don't have the manpower, they're badly outnumbered, and they have no meaningful mobilization plan in place that will allow them to address the manpower problem. So that's the real chink in the armor. But with regard to your question, it's a very interesting question, because if you think about it, what we are doing now in Ukraine is doubling down. We're becoming more committed than ever to making sure the Ukrainians win. Our reputation is really on the line. So what happens if in 2 or 3 months the Ukrainians start to lose in significant ways on the battlefield, and it becomes clear to almost everybody that the Russians are on a roll and the Russians are going to win the war? Whatever victory means, let's leave that aside for the moment. But we are clearly in a situation where the West and NATO and the United States are destined to lose the war. Given all that we've invested in Ukraine, and given that we have just doubled down, what are we going to do then? And this is a worrisome situation, because the temptation to use Western military force to rectify the situation, to double down again, will be a very powerful temptation, and that could lead to really serious trouble. So the fact that the Ukrainians are in all likelihood going to lose is only part of the problem. We also have to think about what the West will then do to rectify the deteriorating situation.
That's exactly what I worry about. It's one of my primary concerns, because I see all these people painting themselves into a big time corner, to where I just don't see how they pivot from Russia can't win, Ukraine must win, to, oh shoot, Ukraine lost. Okay, all right, well, let's just make a new Cold War, make a new iron line, iron curtain, and let's build up our forces. I just don't see them doing that, because they have literally put their reputations on the line for Russia having to lose. And if they don't, I fear that they're going to try to do something to rectify that. And something besides giving money to a now then defunct Ukraine army, which can no longer even use the weapons. And the temptation will be very great for that. Right now, people, John, I think, that say, oh, no, we're not going to send troops there. Biden has said we're not going to. Even Macron says, oh, well, it's just theoretical. Well, if they get faced with, you have to acknowledge the loss or do something different, it's not theoretical anymore.
Yeah, it's just to go to the Iran-Israel conflict and what happened on April 14th when the Iranians attacked Israel. It's very important to understand that the United States was deeply involved in that fight. There's some reports that roughly half of the Iranian drones and cruise missiles were shot down by the Americans, not by the Israelis. Furthermore, it was the Americans who put together the coalition of countries that dealt with that Iranian offensive. You know, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the French, the British, the Israelis, and the Americans. The Americans were in charge. I only raise this issue because it shows you how easy it is for us to get dragged into a fight. In other words, it was not the Israelis versus the Iranians. It was the Israelis plus the Americans plus a number of other countries up against the Iranians. So you can hypothesize situations where Ukraine collapses or begins to collapse, and we feel we have no choice but to get directly involved. Maybe in a subtle way, but nevertheless directly involved. And then you get into the whole business of escalation and what that looks like. So the end result of this vote on Saturday probably won't make any difference in terms of what happens on the battlefield, but it could make a big difference in terms of our participation down the road and the potential for escalation into a war between NATO on one side and the United and the Russians on the other side.
I can't even believe we're having that conversation right now, and the theoretical, or even getting close to being an actual possibility, not a theoretical one.
Well,
I want to,
Danny, if I could just say a
Sure.
quick point. One thing you want to remember about the Americans is we hardly ever back off. We always double down.
it's not reassuring. I know. Can you say 20 years of doubling down in Afghanistan and how'd that work out? Let's don't repeat that one, but yeah, that's kind of what we did. I observed that one firsthand. I want to ask a slightly different question here that was posed to me by a colleague or a retired colonel not long ago, which I found very fascinating, and was looking forward to talking to you with your international relations theorist hat on, because I think that there's more to this than many people are thinking. So whether it's Viktor Orban or a handful of others have been saying, and certainly I have been, that, we need to, seek the best negotiated settlement we can get starting right now. Don't wait for anything else because it'll only get worse, et cetera. But there's actually a potential problem with that, and that is on the Russian side of that, because all these things that we tried with sanctioning them and destroying their economy and all this other kind of stuff, they have retooled and are now pivoted away to other areas where they may not be in a position to need to negotiate. And they may say, once we've accomplished this on the ground and taken this territory, maybe we'll do that. One of my friends actually postulated that there's the potential that if you got into negotiations, Russia may say, okay, we're either going to win this by force, which is more than they have now, or you can cede all of the Zaporizhia, all of these four complexes, the whole Donetsk, without fighting, and let that be the line, and then maybe we'll go and agree to that. What do you think about that possibility?
I think the argument that you're putting forward, that your friend put forward to you, is a powerful argument. I fully understand it. And what this tells me is that we cannot adopt a negotiating strategy that's filled with half measures or is half-hearted. We have to pursue a radical shift in our policy toward Ukraine if we have any hopes of cutting a deal at this point in time. And that means we have to say categorically that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And number two, we have to sever completely the security relationship between the West and Ukraine, and especially the security relationship between the United States and Ukraine. The Russians have to be confident that Ukraine is going to be a neutral country and that the Americans are not going to welch on the deal. This would be a radical policy shift on the part of the United States if it was adopted. And of course, that's why it, in all likelihood, will not be adopted. And we will try to negotiate some sort of settlement where Ukraine eventually gets into NATO or what have you. And the Russians will make it unequivocally clear that this is unacceptable. And we will continue on our merry way supporting Ukraine in this war.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say something that I hope doesn't come to pass. I hope what I'm about to say proves to be false and wrong. But what I think is the more likelihood is that all those things you just said, then this obviously is going to be a video that's going to be out there forever, and it's never going to go away, is that in the future that people will look back on this moment and on those things you said and the radical change, what you said, people will just give their eye teeth if only we could go back to this time and make that decision now, bring this to an end, to limit the damage and actually preserve something of a decent situation for ourselves, the NATO alliance, and even Ukraine. Because if we don't do this radical shift, which you say, I see no evidence that it's going to do anything besides get many more Ukrainians killed, much more territory lost, possibly even the cities of Kharkiv and Odessa, if it goes that far, or we'll be faced with what you said a minute ago, with the possibility of getting into a war with Russia. The arrogance of our leadership and our unwillingness to do anything except for claim victory fills me with fear that that's where we're going.
It's hard to disagree with you. I mean, I think that we're deeply committed to, continuing this fight or keeping the Ukrainians in the fight so that we can damage the Russians and, hope for a miracle somewhere down the road. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think we have to adopt this radical strategy. One of the real problems here, Danny, is the Russians simply don't trust us anymore. They think that Putin thinks, he's made this very clear on at least 3 public occasions, that he trusted the West and he thought the West was negotiating with him in good faith. And it turned out they were not. And he was a fool. He admits he was a fool. And he says he has no intention of ever letting that happen again. Given that attitude on the part of Putin, which I'm sure is shared by many of his lieutenants, if you're in the United States' position, you have to change your policy radically, and you have to do everything possible to convince the Russians that you're sincere and that you're not going to welch on the deal later on.
But John, all of our modern leaders have spent nearly a career demonizing the Russian side, demonizing Putin in particular, and I've even on some talk shows I've been on before been if not attacked, at least addressed with, yeah, but how can you possibly trust Putin? He violates every agreement he's ever had. I could sit there and factually tell you that's not the case. That, I mean, everybody cheats a little bit here and there, but by and large, they've actually held to most of their agreements. But that's irrelevant. The impression is that you can't possibly trust anything. Ergo, no one's going to take this radical approach because they have been taught not to trust anything of the Russians. So you have these two immovable objects, and you have the Ukrainian people being crushed in between them.
Makes me think of that phrase, we are being hoisted on our own petard.
That's not a very pleasant thought. It could be worse.
Another dimension to this too, which is that we have recently been arguing ad nauseum that the Russians are not only evil, but they're bent on conquering all of Europe, and they have the capability to do it. And if that's true, if you're dealing with the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler has the Wehrmacht and is going to try to overrun all of Europe and create Lebensraum, it's very hard to negotiate some sort of compromise settlement with Adolf Hitler. I mean, this is where we're at. All that Russophobia has put us in a position where it's just very hard to see how you work out some sort of negotiated settlement.
Yeah, and here's a comment from Putin, which I think kind of addresses some of this. But Gary, roll that.
Я когда, сейчас тоже Ширака нет, Жака Ширака, он был крупным таким политическим деятелем. Я как-то его спросил, почему американское руководство так себя ведет? Ну, так агрессивно и так недальновидно действует в некоторых случаях. Он мне по-русски ответил, потому что некультурные.
So you see how he kind of views us with disdain, and who's to argue with some of it, but that's kind of really both sides are looking at the other in similar ways, and it's just not filling me with a lot of confidence that we have the statesmanship or the desire or the capacity on either side to end this, and it's just very troubling to me.
I just add one other dimension to what we're talking about here, and that is that I actually think the Russians, and this includes Putin, and I think you see it with the Chinese too, they believe that we are strategic idiots, and they believe that we do things that are not in our interest. And if you go around the world and you talk to lots of people who are not in the West about American policy, for example, vis-a-vis Israel and what's going on in Gaza and what just recently happened with Iran, they simply can't believe that we're allowing ourselves to be pulled into this situation. They just think we're nuts. And they think that what we're doing in Ukraine is remarkably foolish. The whole idea of expanding Ukraine and NATO into Ukraine when the Russians made it clear that they viewed this as an existential threat. And then you have the trouble start in February 2014, and the Americans, instead of backing off and trying to work some sort of modus vivendi out with the Russians, double down, and we end up in a war. And I think a lot of people think, and I certainly think this, and I know you do too, that this just doesn't make good strategic sense. So the Americans are, they're kind of boobs when it comes to planning and executing their grand strategy or their foreign policy. And if you look at all the trouble that we're in around the world, I mean, the situation in the Middle East is turned into a disaster, and there's no hope of it improving anytime soon. The situation in Ukraine, as we have just talked about, is disastrous, and there's no hope of that improving anytime soon from our point of view. And meanwhile, there's huge potential for trouble in East Asia, especially in places like the South China Sea or over Taiwan. And, we've lost our focus there. We're not focusing on the ball out there. So the United States is just in one heck of a lot of trouble.
So let me ask you this in the last few minutes we have here. I think it's self-evident, as you just articulated there, we don't have at least a coherent national strategy. What do you think is the no kidding reason why we don't have that, and what is our foreign policy objective and drive in the administration? What do you think actually animates their decision making? Because there's got to be something. I mean, they can't literally just be going, yeah, I don't know, whatever, let's just do this today. There has to be something, but I can't identify it, and I'm wondering if you can.
Well, first of all, they think there's no limits, right? The whole idea of prioritizing is not part of their worldview. My view is if you're concerned about East Asia, you're concerned about Ukraine, and you're concerned about the Middle East, you can't deal with all three of those areas of the world at once and give them all equal attention. You have to prioritize, but that's not the way the United States thinks. The United States is run by people who think that we can run the world and we don't have to prioritize. Second thing is that I think that the American foreign policy establishment is filled with people who don't have a good sense of the limits of military force. They think the United States is incredibly powerful from a military point of view, and it can wield that military instrument in really effective ways to get what it wants pretty much everywhere on the planet. And if it doesn't use military force, it can use economic sanctions, and those economic sanctions are a deadly effective weapon. And I think there's no question that if you're a great power like the United States, you do want to have a formidable military. I think you do want to have the most formidable military on the planet. But I think it's very important to understand that there are huge limits in terms of what that military can do for you. And if you wander into places like Iraq or Afghanistan, you want to understand that you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. And the military is not going to provide a magic weapon for solving most of the problems you face in Iraq or in Afghanistan. But I think most American elites don't really have that healthy appreciation of the military instrument.
Yeah.
What's happened here is we have a foreign policy that is concerned with running the world, not prioritizing, and using lots of military force or economic sanctions to get our way. And what's happened is that new centers of power in places like China and Russia and even India have come online. And furthermore, you have adversaries who have lots of missiles like Hezbollah and the Iranians. And this makes it very difficult for us to get our way and to execute this foreign policy that we've designed. And we don't seem to learn. I think this is due in good part to the fact that we have hardly any accountability in the American system. People don't get punished for their mistakes. They go to a think tank after they're done, then they come back in the next administration. So there's little accountability, little learning, and this, I think, explains in part, it's just a partial explanation, but
Yeah,
I
but
think
it's a
it
big part.
explains in good part, why we're in such a mess today.
Yeah, I think that is obviously politics and electoral politics is another big influence in that. But I think that the bigger issue, as you say, is the most rational explanation. We still think this is 1990 or maybe even 2003 when we could literally do whatever we want, tell even our allies to go hang themselves, our adversaries, we're going to do whatever we're going to want to do, and they couldn't do anything about it really. That world doesn't exist anymore, and we have not figured that out yet, and we may soon to our demise. John, thanks so much for coming on today. It's always an absolute pleasure to have you come on and provide some of these great insights that, even oftentimes on our channel, we don't get into it unless we have you on there. So we're very grateful for that and look forward to seeing you on our next episode.
My pleasure, Danny. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for you guys joining us too. We're always very grateful for you coming and join us. We do ask you to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really means a lot to us. Also, here in just best about an hour from now, Doug McGregor is going to come on. He's going to talk about what Ukraine aid signals to the world. So we're going to look at a different aspect of this. Definitely don't want to miss that. Come back and join us at 3 p.m. Eastern time today, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.